Good morning, buenos dias. Good to have you all with us. I'm sure we're going to have a few more people arriving, but in honor of those that have showed up on time, we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to thank the Library of Congress and the Hispanic Division, Dr. Dorn, Dr. Tenenbaum, who are here today with us, for co-organizing, co-sponsoring this. We're very fortunate to have two of the great scholars of Mexico, probably the greatest of U.S. scholars of Mexico, without wanting to offend any of our other colleagues, of course. And the man who's often referred to as the father of public opinion in analysis in Mexico, with us today, with no offense to other people who do public opinion in Mexico either. But Rod Camp is going to be presenting three of his books. He is, as I said, perhaps the best U.S. scholar working on Mexico, certainly the most prolific, and he's here to present three books to you that have come out in the last year. As we were talking last night, he could be presenting four, but he actually presented the one came out last year, but he's already presented that last year, so we got that off. But these are three, unlike people who write books, there are a number of people we could name who are celebrities who sort of write books over the weekend, and they sell because of their name, and they're sort of half good, and we could name a few examples, but we won't. All of these books are really good, and they're all unique in what they are. And let me say, one is a book that is an update of his political biographies. If you want to find out, for example, who Lázaro Cárdenas is, you might say that you saw this guy sitting over here, Lázaro Cárdenas. You think he may have done something in Mexico at some point. You can go to the political biographies. There's actually information on what he has done. This is a systematic updating that Dr. Camp has done for now, how long, actually?
40 years.
40 years of Mexican political biographies. And he's used this, his last book, the one that he presented last year. One of the things he's done is not only keep these updated as a reference work, but he actually uses this to analyze how Mexican politics has changed as well. And so this has been the basis for a lot of work that he's done, and as well as other people have done, also based on this to try and understand how generations of political elites and economic and religious and other elites, military elites, have changed over time. And he's looked at a number of these. And he's written a couple other books on this as well. Well, quite a few other books, actually, on this as well. A second book that he's going to talk about with you is the Oxford Handbook of Mexican Politics, which is out there. It's a modest little book. No, it's the giant book that looks like this. Yes. If you get upset at someone, you could throw it at them. Please don't, but you could. It is the compendium of, I would say probably, we were talking about this last night as well, I mean, it really is the book, if you're teaching a class on Mexico, or if you simply follow Mexico and you want to know what the latest research is, it is the compendium of the latest research on Mexico. It's a different niche here. I mean, one is sort of the reference work. This is also a reference work in a way, but it's a reference work of almost every issue you can think about in Mexican politics by top scholars from Mexico and the United States and a couple other countries who have written trying to tell you what the latest research is. And the third one is a completely different niche, actually. It is what everyone needs to know about Mexico. Mexico, what everyone else needs to know. It is part of a series that Oxford does, and it is really a series of 100 questions, if I'm not mistaken, it's 100, right? Somewhere in that ballpark of questions that people might want to ask about Mexico. And I know Steve Chaplin knows this book because he's using it in his course. I was there on Tuesday, and sure enough, everyone had a copy. I went to another course at National Defense University yesterday. Jim Dickmeyer teaches, and sure enough, everyone had a copy of it there. It is, for any of you who teach, it is sort of the perfect reference work, perfect, easy, accessible work for people who need to know quickly about Mexico. This is not for specialists. The other two are for specialists. This is one that really is for a general audience, taking a lifetime of academic achievement and bringing it to a general audience. So Rod will talk about all this. You have his bio here. I'm not going to give it to you. He's at Claremont McKenna. He's his named chair, professor of the Pacific Rim. Miguel Basáñez, however, we're very happy has joined us as well. Miguel has been here a number of times, but it's the first time we had the pleasure of him formally speaking. Miguel has known Rod for 30 years, I think.
Yep.
They've collaborated on a number of things together. Miguel is really, among other things, he's been both in public life and in academia. He served in a number of positions. Among them, he was actually an attorney general of the state of Mexico at one point. He was the pollster for the president of Mexico, and did a number of other things. But he really started the movement of public opinion research in Mexico, and is on a worldwide level a very recognized figure in this as well. He was the president of WAPOR, the World Association of Public Opinion researchers, the most prestigious organization of public opinion researchers in the world. One of his students, Alejandro Moreno, who many of you know because he was a scholar here at the Wilson Center and has spoken here a number of times, is now the president of WAPOR, actually. So he really generated a whole other generation of people involved in public opinion research. He did it at a time when people were skeptical. Some politicians would say, as I'm sure he will tell us, that citizens don't really know anything, why ask them? And he started to go out and actually ask citizens before Mexico was a fully competitive democracy, he says in an understatement. He started to ask what actually citizens thought. He asked this in the 1988 elections in very controversial ways. And he did this as someone who had been in government, actually, someone who was not seen as necessarily an opposition figure, someone who was actually simply as a professional started to wonder what it is that citizens thought and generated a whole current of people and a whole movement of people concerned about what citizens think, which has become a huge industry in Mexico today, as well as much more professionalized than it was back then. There were a few people who did it sort of for politicians, but that was about it. He has written a number of academic works. He's currently at Fletcher. He runs a research center at Fletcher, but he's done a great deal of work. His book, The Struggle for Hegemony in Mexico, is sort of one of the leading works on Mexican politics. And his work on North American trajectory with Ron Engelhardt and his work on human values and beliefs, Ron Engelhardt, are also very well-known works. And it's a pleasure to have both of you here. Miguel is going to moderate and comment, and Rod is going to present. So I'll turn it over to Miguel, and then you'll hear from Rod about the three latest of his 30 or so books. How many books have you written, Rod? Written and edited?
30. That's good enough.
Good enough, okay.
30-something. You already lost
thank
track.
you both for being here. And I should say Rod is also a member of the Mexico Institute Advisory Board, as is Diana Negroponte is here. So, Miguel.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be in the Wilson Center, and my intellectual journey began 30 years ago here in the Wilson Center at an invitation from Lawrence Whitehead. He was in Oxford and came here, and that's where we began. And then a few weeks later, Rod and I get to know, and we have been best friends for 30 years, the intellectuals twins. Your passion for understanding what individuals do and my passion for understanding what individuals think has put us together in this trajectory. Without any further ado, you are going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then I make some comments, 10, 15 minutes, and then we open the session to your questions. Okay.
And I want to say that when we open up the session, I'll be happy to try to comment on any questions you have on contemporary Mexican politics, but particularly on the forthcoming presidential election, as well as all the issues related to drug trafficking in Mexico as well. And I want to thank Andrew and Christopher here at the center, as well as Georgette from the Library of Congress, for creating this opportunity to do this. I really appreciate it very much. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the biographies book, which unfortunately we don't have a copy here. And the reason why I'm going to talk about that is that it actually, ironically, is what started my career. It's not sort of the usual track, I think, for a scholar to be doing a reference. It's actually the first book that I published was a reference book. And it basically formed the way in which I began to look at Mexican politics and understand Mexican politics. So when I first started doing research in the late 1960s on Mexico, there really exists very little published information about how political decisions were made and the behavior of leadership. And as you know, Mexico was a semi-authoritarian political model during that period, and therefore information wasn't available, not just to scholars or outsiders, but also to politicians themselves. So in fact, having any kind of political information, including biographical information about politicians, was a real asset. It was politically valuable in Mexico. Well, I was very fortunate to have studied here in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University under the late Mario Rodriguez, who actually was a Central Americanist and a contributor to the Hispanic Division for many years. And he introduced me to the Hispanic Division at the Library of Congress. And my relationship with the library has lasted for more than 40 years. It started out with Dolores Martin and Georgette, and then later Tasha Tenenbaum and Tracy North, who's here today too. In those early days, I was permitted into what I would describe as the wonderful stacks of the Library of Congress, where I discovered a lot of helpful biographical and autobiographical information about Mexican politicians. And it was really essential for the research that I was beginning to do on politicians. And what was particularly helpful to me is that the Library of Congress at that time had the only collection of Mexican phone books in the United States. And I used those phone books to get the addresses of Mexican politicians. In those days, people actually had their names in the phone books. And that's how I began to contact Mexican politicians all over, not just in the federal district, but also at the states level. So I wrote letters, probably 15% of the people that received them answered them, and I arranged many interviews in Mexico with those individuals, and it was a means of substituting for the lack of published information. Because I did all of the biographical research myself, I began collecting them on individual 3x5 cards and filing them. I began to see a lot of interesting patterns among Mexican politicians going all the way back to the 1930s, both at the state level and at the national level. And these patterns indicated how politicians were actually recruited in Mexico, what institutions had played the most important role in carrying out those relationships, which agencies were most important in the careers of politicians, and which agencies were most influential on policy making. And many of those patterns continued into the democratic transition of the 1980s and 1990s, while others have changed significantly. So basically, I chose to use what I would call collective biography. That is an analysis of leadership and decision-making involving hundreds and literally later thousands of politicians to provide a more complete and original understanding of the inner workings of Mexican politics. And that methodology, I believe, proved to be a very effective tool in understanding the democratic transition that's taken place in Mexico. And if you compare the pre-democratic era to the democratic transition period in the 80s and 90s to the post-2000 era, you can see how significant some of these transitions were. And if, as Andrew mentioned, if you want to understand, based on 3,000 analysis of 3,000 political biographies, what those differences were, when they occurred, and why were they important, you can get this earlier book that was published about 15 months ago called A Metamorphosis of Leadership in a Democratic Mexico, which is published by Oxford. The appropriateness of this methodology turned out to be enhanced by, I think, a lot of other features of Mexican political culture. One was the networking system in Mexico, which the Mexicans at that time called the Camarilla system, although it went all the way back to the 19th century, which was related to the issue of trust and to the weakness of institutions. So people were relying on their personal relationships with each other, which actually is a characteristic of many other cultures, the Middle East, China, so on. Secondly, that made the importance of personal recommendations essential in arranging contacts with people, getting jobs, and so forth and so on. It was very important to my ability to meet other individuals and to expand those contacts. And then the third point I would make is that it wasn't just, I soon discovered, it wasn't just a system confined to politicians, but it also was connected to intellectuals, to the officer corps, to the higher clergy, to important Mexican entrepreneurs and capitalists. And one of the ways that I discovered that initial linkage to those other groups, and intellectuals was the first group that I looked at, is that after my study of politicians, I realized, and I discovered this through the Library of Congress's division, its legal studies division, had an incredible collection of law theses from the National University of Mexico. And those theses, just like most theses, have a title page and then a page that shows the names of the individuals who were on the person's thesis committee. And those individuals turned out to be, in many cases, prominent politicians and intellectuals. And I could see what the linkage was between, the initial linkage between politicians and intellectuals. And that led me to a whole different element of study. Well, the first edition of this book was published in 1976, followed by a second edition in 1982, a third edition in 1995 published by the University of Texas Press, and now this final edition also published by the UT Austin Press. And it had 600 biographies in the first edition, and as I mentioned, it has 3,000 biographies today, so it's grown exponentially. The manuscript actually was this tall, 4,000 pages. My wife took a picture of me, so because it was towering over me to prove that it was really that long. And it was based not just on finding biographical and autobiographical information, but very extensively also on interviews, where I got a lot of personal information that wouldn't appear in published sources. And also letters, some fascinating letters, which I've donated actually last year to the UT Austin collection for research on Mexico. And this book is also valuable, in addition to the 3,000 biographies, which is what most people always talk about. I think equally valuable are the appendices to the book, which include every state governor, every Supreme Court justice, every member of Congress since 1935, every member of the Senate, all assistant secretaries of all cabinet agencies, the ambassadors to most major countries that Mexico considers significant, party leaders, union leaders, and so on. That provides a very valuable way of looking at other politicians, particularly politicians that aren't among the 3,000 biographies that are in the book. You could actually create a skeletal biography of somebody else. What is particularly valuable about this book today, and I did it because, trust me, I don't plan on doing a 5th edition, is I got research funds and created a CD which includes a PDF, readable PDF file and a searchable PDF file of all the biographies in one file. So you can search whatever you're interested in. And the same thing, a separate PDF file of the appendices. You can also do a search through that. So you could look at, for one person, and see all the different positions that person might have held. The other thing I did is how I do all of the political analysis of this information is using a more sophisticated statistical program, and I asked some students at Claremont McKenna to create a program taking not all but most of the biographical information in the book and putting it in accessible form. And they used a very reasonable program, I think it's $100, called Microsoft Access. And you can use that program right off of the CD, and you can search any 2 variables, so like place of birth and date of birth, and you can see, oh, well, there were 14 politicians that came from this little town, and 3 of them overlapped with each other. They obviously had to go to the same elementary school and so on. And you can start to see how these relationships develop very early. Exactly. Great example.
Chilotepec, Michoacán, or something like that.
So why was this really useful in understanding Mexican politics? I think it is obviously important to see how people get to the top of the political ladder. And this applies actually to all politicians, not just to members of PRI in the earlier era, but also panistas and members of PRD. I also became interested in what influenced their ideas, so I was also looking at socialization, and that probably got started because of my conversations with Mexican politicians, and in turn how those ideas affected policy choices. And you'll see there's a chapter in the book that I mentioned that was published 15 months ago on the impact of that. I looked at that particularly during the Alemán era. I mentioned that my work had led me to intellectuals, and for many decades, what I would argue to you that the single most important institutions in Mexico, both for political recruitment and political socialization and political networking, actually were educational institutions, the National University and the National Preparatory School. That was true from the 1930s through the 1990s. And most priistas, most members of PRI during that era were not militant members of the party. They were nominal members, meaning they just had a PRI ID card, and that was the extent of their involvement in the PRI. So unlike many scholars, in fact, the leading book of the times in the 1960s by Robert Scott said the party was the determinant of public policy in Mexico, which was a completely mistaken understanding of how the system actually worked. In the last 4 decades, I would estimate I've probably spoken to somewhere between 900 and 1,000 Mexicans from all of these leadership categories. And that included 7 presidents that I interviewed over time. What did I learn from applying this methodology? Well, I think it obviously provided a lot of original information that you wouldn't get anywhere else. I think when you interview somebody, if you can be successful in an interview, you kind of develop a bond of trust. And that resulted in a lot of friendships with Mexican politicians over the years. So I would actually meet with people, sometimes with individuals over a 25-year period, and I would see how their perceptions change. It allowed me to understand generational perspectives, different ideological perspectives, gender perspectives that I otherwise would not have understood or experienced. I've been allowed to go on working trips with politicians, campaigns, including 2 campaigns with presidential candidates, a work trip with a sitting Mexican president, or even attending a mass with an archbishop in Mexico. So those kinds of experiences were very useful in understanding the realities of Mexican politics. And I would say the final thing that I would have learned from using this technique is that regardless of the leadership group that I examined, whether it was the officer corps or Catholic bishops or artists and intellectuals, most have been mentored by other older elites from their same category. That is, they're the disciples of equally prominent individuals who were artists and intellectuals and capitalists and so on. So that personal linkage is another way of tying one generation to the next in Mexico, and I think it had a lot of important consequences, some of which we don't even still fully understand because they're very informal. Well, let me make a couple of comments about the other 2 books. Andrew has already indicated to you that the Mexico, what everyone needs to know. Let's see. Could you hold that up, Kay? It's part of this series. It's published by Oxford University Press. A few other countries, such as Cuba, has a similar book. And my editor at Oxford, Angela Chepneko, and my wife, Emily, talked me into writing this book because, as you can gather, I was already very busy with several other books. But, and this was published just a couple of months ago. And it relies on what I thought was a really imaginative idea by Oxford of having the author create, as Andrew suggested, about 100 questions and then answering them in just a page or 2. And I have to tell you that even if you are a so-called expert on a country, when you create 100 questions like this and then have to answer them and be very concise, it's amazing how well-informed you can become about the same topic. It's sort of a separate education of becoming more of a Renaissance scholar on your own country or area of expertise. This book, in addition to having the interpretation, has a lot of very up-to-date statistical information supportive of many of those interpretations. It ranges from economics to history to culture and so on. And I completed this research last year, and Oxford really, in a very admirable way, got this published very quickly. So it's extremely up to date, even though it came out in September. The third book, this massive handbook of Oxford Handbook of Mexican Politics, is also part of an Oxford series that they've done on political science generally and in other areas. The political science general one is a standard set of reference works on American politics, political theory, and so on and so forth. And I was honored to be asked to be the general editor of the book. This book was just published 2 weeks ago, so that's why it wasn't on our invitation. As Andrew implied, if you're interested in any aspect of Mexican politics or public policy or economic development, it also includes 2 wonderful chapters by 2 leading historians that leads into the book, because really the fundamental focus of the book is how each person's area of expertise. Miguel did a chapter on the whole history of public opinion polling and politics in Mexico, but the real focus is on what was the impact on the democratic transformation and also what I would call the efforts to consolidate Mexico's democracy. Andrew has a chapter on local politics, and Peter Smith has a chapter on comparing Mexico with other South American countries. So I will stop with that and whatever you'd like to add. Miguel?
Yeah, on the history of public opinion. Okay. Let me make a few comments on what Rod has said. When I was finishing my PhD in London, that was in 1980, I came across what Rod had, all what he had done, and particularly through the Latin American Handbook of the Library of Congress. And we met here in Washington 30 years ago at a LASA meeting, and after having read all what he had, and he also had read what I had just published that year, we thought that we have been known each other for years. And we began just talking and thinking on projects and doing things. And a few weeks later, I was visiting him in Pella in Iowa, where he was at the Central College. And what he mentioned about his 3x5 cards, I was afraid that he was really a CIA agent. That how could he have so much information about Mexico? And then I got to see his cards and all the work. And what I can tell is that it's a really hard work with dedication, and the depth that Rod has put into that is amazing. Since that year, he kept on going to Mexico 3 weeks every year to visit all the guys, and then we were fortunate enough that he kept on coming to our home, and my kids drove him around Mexico City in all the interviews, and those were great experiences. So we were very close together since, and we, in a way, were sharing a lot of experiences. I can recall the first national survey that I took. It was about the bank nationalization in Mexico in 1982, and that I was working for López Portillo, and that's when what Andrew said, that I was telling Mr. President, let's ask the public, and he said, the public? But they are ignorant. Let's ask the experts. Who they are? Well, the secretaries, the governors, the officials. I said, okay. But so we did that first survey, and Rod and I had access to the data of that, and actually that was our first publication in Colegio de Mexico, analyzing the data for the 1982 nationalization. The second one, important, was the first poll of a presidential election in 1988. And Rod was at home when all the pressure from government for that poll not to be taken and not to be published, he was a witness of that. And I recall when the editor of Jornada, who had hired us to do the survey, called and said, sorry, but will not be able to publish. And then Rod said, I have a friend in the New York Times. I think he could publish it. And he made the phone call. And, of course, our phones those days were tapped. So after Rod's friend said, yes, we could do it, a few hours later, Jornada solved the problems, and they were able to publish it. So those were the days of the kind of the environment that we had. But I was just amazed on how what he was finding through all these interviews, those trends of social and political upward mobility that he was deriving from his interviews, from his biographies, were so true. I was living those things. So we began kind of a very stimulant interaction that I enjoyed, and that I recall in every visit that Rod, we call and we organize a conference with the students and professors at Colegio de Mexico, ITAM, wherever we had a chance, and those were very, very interesting and productive years. When I was, we met a couple of months ago in Rod's weekend cottage in Vermont. They live in California, but their weekend home is in Vermont. That's only typical of the U.S. and I was trying, he in a way is a synthesis of so much knowledge about Mexico. And when you look at the structure of the handbook, you can see what is Rod's brilliance. It has really 5 parts: the history of Mexico, and then the institutions, how history falls into institutions, and then how the institutions changes through actors, old and new actors, and they start changing, and how that turns into attitudes and policy. So in a way, that's kind of the X-ray of Rod Camp's thinking. And I think it's I really have enjoyed being your friend for so many years. Okay, let's open the floor for question and answer. Andrew.
Let me push you on one before it goes to a general discussion here, which is, tell us something I know you've talked about before. Has the nature of the elites in Mexico, particularly the political elites, but also business, church, military, and others, has it changed with democracy? In what way? And will it change again if the PRI wins for Rod? And for Miguel, is the PRI going to win? You're following the public opinion polls, or
okay.
Is this a wide open election and can anything happen? What's your read of where we are in the opinion polls? So, two of you.
Well, there's no question that there have been certain changes, but it depends on what aspect of leadership you're looking at. I think the most likely aspect that you can even determine that those changes have been real, rather than imagined, have been characteristics of leadership. Just to take one example that I think is interesting, and it's a reflection of more competition, electoral competition, is there have been 2 shifts. One is that the importance of state leadership has increased significantly. It's sort of like a return to the 30s and 40s and 50s, when it was also much more important. Now we're going back. And you can see this in the source of presidential candidates in the last 3 elections. And you can see it in other ways, but that's just an example of it. The other way to look at it, and it kind of relates to the other part of your question, is one significant change is the career origin of many leading politicians, and the importance of business in the background of politicians has also increased dramatically. That's pretty obvious among PON members, but I think what's more surprising is that PRI has emulated this. So here's a way that PON has influenced PRI. And again, it started at the state level, and then now you see it more commonly in the cabinet or sub-cabinet. those all have implications for ideas, for policy preferences, and so on and so forth. The question you ask about, if PRI were to win this forthcoming presidential election is a really good one, and we probably all have that in the back of our minds. I would just speculate and say it obviously would have some aspects that would be distinctive from the two prior PON administrations, but I would argue that PRI has been changed more by the last 12 years than suddenly PRI is going to come around and change back to something that it was. I frankly don't believe that at all. And it'll be interesting to see in this election itself what PRI is really proposing that is going to be different from PON on two major issues. One is, how do you increase personal income in Mexico, and how do you reduce violence and therefore increase personal security? Those are the two fundamental issues. And the most controversial one is the latter one, the personal security. What are they going to do that's different from President Calderon? And if so, what impact is that going to have? Then I'll let Miguel answer the hard.
Is PRI going to win? Of course, if you read the latest polls, and I would like to make a warning about here. We have about a dozen pollsters, serious pollsters, that know their job in Mexico. But of course, if you are reading so many polls, you get confused. So it is important to understand those that have their preference for each of the three parties, and then they normally make their polls public when are beneficial for the party that normally commission those polls. And there are three that are connected to the media. And those are the ones that I tend to follow. Because with following three that are not connected to any party, you can get the whole story. So reading those three polls, you would say, right now, can you say which one? Reforma, Universal, and Campos. Moreno, Ordóñez, y Roy Campos. When you look at the numbers for Peña right now, he's 40% of the vote intention, and López Obrador is 20, and PAN is around 17. But they don't have a decision yet. Now, if you look at that, you say, okay, it is clear PRI is going to win. But you have to think that that's exactly the same thing that we had 6 years ago, when López Obrador was 40, and then you had Calderón 20, and so you say, okay, with 20 points difference, it's clear that he's going to win. But López Obrador 6 years ago had been on the daily press conferences, and he was really doing a great job on raising his relevance. So that's the same that has been happening with Enrique Peña now. So as the campaign begins, my sense is that what we will see is a narrowing of the margin between PRD and PRI. I think that PAN in this election is going to have the same preference as PRI had 6 years ago, so meaning that it's going to be around 18 points or so. And that the election, my feeling is that it's going to be a tight election, a competed election between PRI and PRD. López Obrador has matured a lot, has learned a lot, is of course, because of he's older and Enrique is younger, so in terms of experience, the debates are going to be tough. So my sense is that we are going to approach June with something around the mid-30s for each. And it will depend on how they do what is going to be the final outcome.
Each, you mean PRD and PRI?
PRD and PRI. I'm leaving PAN behind, like in 18 points. What Madrazo got last year, last election. So that's so far my feeling. Dolia. You had asked before.
It's been a real privilege to hear you describe your career, and I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot by listening to you. I was surprised that I counted 3 times when you mentioned the church, the Catholic Church. So I glanced through this book, and I see there are only 4 references to the church. The first time I went to Mexico, if you'll permit a personal reference, was 1950, when I wrote a magazine piece about the Catholic Church in Mexico at that time, which obviously was very different. Clerics weren't even permitted to appear on the streets in clerical garb. I wonder, today, do you still count the Catholic Church as an important force of movers and shakers? And at the same time, is there a role in electoral and legislative politics for evangelicals who have grown very rapidly over the past few decades?
I think in the case of Mexico, well, I would say 2 things. One is that the Catholic Church played a very important role and an undervalued role in the transition to democratic politics. They were critical in urging ordinary Mexicans to vote, both in '94 and in 2000, and that has been understudied, even though I've studied it and written about it. Is that because of the Plum heritage? It's because most scholars don't give it, just aren't interested in the relationship between religion and politics, and they don't explore it, even though we have more empirical information than we have ever had. And I think if you go back and look at the literature and the public statements that bishops published in their individual dioceses, or even collectively in multiple dioceses, the evidence is clearly there in terms of what they were telling their parishioners to do. If you also look at the 2006 report from the Electoral Commission, because of the controversy and the outcome, you'll see that there were complaints about the church being involved in individual priests, saying something publicly, but those protests were very minor. What I would say today, the most important role, the church plays 2 roles, and under Fox it was doing one of these roles more actively. It has always been a critic. It actually is a critic of neoliberalism. It was a critic under Zedillo and a very strong critic under Fox about the failure of the government to address more effectively poverty in Mexico, which is one of the 2 major issues in Mexico. The second area where there was a tremendous agreement, and I wrote a book on the Catholic Church, and I interviewed a lot of bishops and priests, and they all agreed, regardless of whether they were traditionalists or progressive or in the middle, that there was agreement on human rights, and that they would stand up for human rights, and they actually practiced this in the 90s in particular. What is interesting to me is that in terms of the increased amount of allegations of human rights abuses during the drug war strategy, and particularly by the armed forces in Mexico, is that they haven't been outspoken the way they were in the 90s, when it was the armed forces and police and other actors that were responsible for human rights abuse. Only a few selective bishops have made very clear statements. I think the reason for that, which you'll understand, is they feel like they're in a somewhat tenuous position. They want to support the legitimacy of institutions, and if you'll recall, they were very supportive of the electoral court decision, trying to support the democratic process in Mexico. But now they feel as though if they, I think, I'm surmising this because I haven't actually gone down and interviewed bishops, that if they're too openly active in terms of criticizing the human rights record, that they'll be criticizing democratic governmental institutions. So I'm actually surprised that it hasn't been a more vociferous and universal response to those abuses.
Is there any kind of evangelical?
I would say that in the case of Mexico, you don't see anything at all approaching the impact that evangelicals have in Brazil and parts of Central America. It hasn't caught on the way that some people expected and some people predicted in the case of Mexico, where politically the most significant aspect of evangelical Protestantism, in my opinion, in terms of church-state relations, is conflicts between Catholics and evangelical Protestants, which has led sometimes to violence and a lot of physical movement of people leaving small villages and going to other locations because of one group dominating the other group. But other than that, you just don't see it as politically significant at all.
Dolia y luego Kevin. Dolia.
The reason for the microphone is that we have a video broadcast. By
I'm aware of that. Well, I have two quick questions, Rod. One has to do with the relationship of the two PAN governments that we have had, Fox and Calderón, with the intelectuales. You refer to this, and I believe that probably during Fox there was a little bit more of a relationship. I mean, Jorge Castañeda was his first foreign minister. But I don't see that with Calderón. On the contrary, I see him very hostile towards the intellectuales' criticism, fair or unfair, of his government. The same thing with the media. This government, Calderón, has really blamed us for the bad image Mexico has constantly. And he hasn't really done much to solve the violence against reporters, increasingly to the point that Mexico scores second after Iraq by all standards, UN, NGOs, in terms of violence. So I know you've seen the evolution of the media, the way the media is playing a more important role, free media, independent opinion. That wasn't the case during the PRI. And my second question has to do with why did the PRI choose Peña Nieto as their candidate when Peña Nieto is by all standards much less of a perceived competent politicians of the previous government, of the previous presidents that we have had in terms, just why Peña Nieto and not someone else that is much more appealing and intellectual and perceived as a more possibly competent president than this one. And you mentioned, Miguel, that you see that the polls will split between Andrés Manuel and Peña Nieto 30-30. What would make Peña Nieto fall so much?
Well, I think, of course, in the case, as you know, PRI would have had a primary, and it was actually the first party to have a real primary, not unlike the closed primary, which PAN has always used to select its presidential candidate. And just so everybody realizes this, the other leading candidate, who was probably 40 points behind Peña Nieto, Beltrones, who was the Senate leader of the PRI, just conceded basically because he wanted to eliminate any divisions in the party before the general election, and may, as American politicians do, made an agreement with Peña Nieto and said, I would like such cabinet position in order for me to concede this. But obviously he wasn't going to even come close to winning the nomination. And of course the same thing happened basically in PRD, but it was done through public opinion polls and also a concession there. It's kind of interesting how this occurred. So it's not, I have to say two things. because of the shift in importance back to state politics, if it's going to be governor, you can either get enough notoriety. I mean, a lot of people have political ambitions, but only a certain small number of people have enough recognition that they can actually translate that into a successful presidential campaign just to get their party's nomination. So you have two things: the proximity of Peña Nieto to the federal district, which still dominates Mexican national politics, and being the governor of the state of Mexico. Look at the guy has 94% recognition. You don't get much better than that until you're halfway through the actual presidential election. So that gives him an advantage. What Miguel talked about. This is exactly what López Obrador had. Calderón had about 60% when he started out. Nobody really knew who he was. The disadvantage is many politicians who have that high recognition have high negative recognition. What's interesting about Peña Nieto is he has extraordinarily high positive recognition and very low negative recognition. So the difference between the negative and the positives for Peña Nieto are incredible. That is not true of López Obrador today, nor is it true of the PAN candidates, with the exception of Vasquez Mota. She has very positive, largely because she's unknown, so nobody has a negative reason, and they don't necessarily have a positive, but they're neutral, which is good for her because it means she can earn that positive evaluation. So geographical proximity, how well known the individual is, and going back to your point about the media, most Mexicans, just like most Americans, get their political news from the electronic media, TV, and from the print media, but particularly from the electronic media. Peña Nieto, one thing most people agree about him is he has a great photographic appeal on television. Okay, maybe if he opens his mouth, that doesn't always work out so well. But and I said this to you earlier, Dolia, that you can't judge Mexican politics on the basis of what either an elite Mexican would say, a well-educated Mexican would say, and what you and I would say. You have to judge it on the basis of what would an ordinary Mexican say about these candidates, and keep that in mind as this election gets going. And your other question about the linkage between intellectuals and the media, I think one of the reasons that's made that even a more difficult relationship, and that Calderón obviously doesn't think he has a need to sort of go out and cultivate intellectuals, is that there's not the same kind of relationship as existed prior to 2000, in which, just think about it, think of all the intellectuals, the prominent intellectuals that have held important posts in Mexican government, particularly in foreign relations and public education, and of course in a lot of ambassadorial posts. It still continues somewhat in a few ambassadorial posts, but almost no cases of it at the cabinet level. Well, it's because intellectuals aren't part of formal public life. They're part of public life independently of government. That's a significant change in the democratic transition. So it's leading to much more tension. I mean, politicians generally don't like media because at some point they're going to get bad press. So then they get upset. They like it when they're getting good press. Yeah, I mean, you see this in America, and I, kind of witnessed this personally in talking to prominent politicians, pre-politicians in the past, when this would happen to them, and then all of a sudden, the media is a bad guy because they're not getting the press they would like. But I think those other reasons are the most important.
Let me make a comment about the intellectuals. When Reyes Robles, myself, and others set up the magazine Este País, we started talking very highly about the politicians hunting intellectuals. And I think, in a way, that made very clear. And when Carlos Salinas got several intellectuals very close to them and what happened and what was the outcome, I think that made an impact on what intellectuals, the proximity of intellectuals to political power. Kind of, it's better to be a little bit far away. Now, going back to what, I didn't say that López Obrador and Enrique is going to be 30-30. No, I said mid to high 30s. So I think they are going to be around the 35s, so, which would mean for Enrique coming down 5 points and for López Obrador going up, well, on the level that he has now is a lot, but on the level that he got 6 years ago, the 34, is around that. My sense is that it's going to be tough for him going back to the 34, but that will very much depend on what happens during the elections, during the campaigns, what are the issues, and the debates, the way they come out of debates. But my feeling is that the election is going to be around the mid-30s, mid-35s, 37. That is where we are going to be approaching by the end of June.
Let me just add something to what Miguel is saying. Two things. One is that what we know from 2000 and 2006 is that campaigns do matter. They alter the outcomes. They altered both predicted outcomes in both cases. And secondly, as campaigns get underway, negatives increase. They don't go down, they go up. So depending on who gets more of those negative responses from potential voters, that is what determines the outcome. And there's been a really wonderful study that Alejandro Moreno, Miguel's former student at Reforma, did a few months ago. He calls these voters the indignant voters. I think it's a very apt name. And it's incredible. These are the people that are most unsatisfied with democracy, most unsatisfied with the economic direction, and most unsatisfied with security. And why? Because in the case of the economic issue, they've either lost a job or they view the economy as not favorable to their future ambitions. Or in the case of personal security, they were a victim of something related to security. And when you look at how they respond to these questions, in some cases, I'll just give you an example. Those viewing the economy's direction negatively, 75% of those people view it negatively, whereas 38% of all other Mexicans view it negatively. Viewing security negatively, 63% to 36%. And viewing partly satisfied with democracy, which is a much broader critical issue about Mexico's political future, 73% of the indignant versus 47% of everyone else. So those people, those individuals, are going to have a very significant impact because they hold their views more intensely because of personal experiences affect their perception. No, I don't think it has anything to do with their class background. It has to do with whether they qualify for those definitions of what happened to them.
What you just mentioned, that recalled me that in '94, the presidential debate produced the same effect. When Cedillo, Diego Fernandez, and Cárdenas had that debate in '94, Cedillo was, before the debate, something like 50% of the preference, and Diego was 20. After the debate, they both tie around 35. So that was an overnight effect. That was kind of shocking. That's the kind of movements that I think we will see. Kevin?
Kevin Clacci. Rod, after 20 years of talking to you by phone, it's nice to be in the same room with you.
Thank you. You too.
I guess one comment before the questions, and Enrique Peña would be the first taco de ojo president, I guess, if he keeps quiet, for the ladies. They say in Spanish, tacos de ojo, eye tacos don't make you fat, so a handsome president would be a good thing for Mexico, right? The two questions, one for whoever wants to handle it. One, a simple security question. There's a lot of talk that if the PRI comes back to power, they may go back to the old school method of favoring one cartel over the others and let everything else fall where it may. Realistically, can that happen? Or is the genie out of the bottle at this point? Can you go backwards on that? And then the broader political question, having covered the last three campaigns, one thing that seemed real apparent to me was the PRI has never been monolithic, and there's always been a regional divide. You've got Beltrones and Gamboa still the power kingmakers. Can you talk about geography? And, we know what parts of the state, historically, what is the swing that's going to make the difference in this election, since geography is fairly well known in these races?
Yeah, good question. The most important thing is to look at the pre-governors, and if the pre-governors have high favorable images of their performance, and most of them do in the 70s or higher, that translates into a much higher vote among the people living in those states for the presidential candidate of PRI. It's a very interesting effect. And that's another thing I should have mentioned. One of the most interesting aspects of 2006 is the importance of regionalism, the regional distribution now of those votes. So I think it's a way, it's sort of like reverse coattails, where the local people can affect the national outcome rather than the national outcome affecting the local. It'll be very interesting to see. The security question also, I agree with you. Actually, Dolly and I were talking about this before the session, and, that's a contradiction. You can't go back. If indeed that's the way PRI handled drug cartel relationships in the past, well, it's not the same situation. You have a lot more cartels, and the competition is intense. And if you believe that, by favoring two of those cartels or three, you're going to solve the problem, that just isn't going to work. What you would have to do is make a deal that would basically determine all of the areas of responsibility, sort of like gang warfare in major metropolitan areas. Okay, what's your turf? And there's agreement on what the turf is. Okay, if you could actually do that, well, you might be successful in pursuing that strategy. But as Dolia suggested, you're dealing with some really weird, unpredictable, strange people, not necessarily rational people. So I find, that's why I find the most interesting aspect of this forthcoming election is what is going to be the publicly stated strategy of PRI. Mm-hmm. If it wants to win this election and it wants to keep, maintaining its high positives for Peña Nieto, it has to come up with something different, because this is what people are expecting a change in government to do, to solve that problem. And it's not going to be easy to solve.
Tenemos una pregunta al fondo, en medio, y a la derecha. Al fondo, sorry, we have a question at the very bottom.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm Mr. Lloyd. One of the strongest tests of a functioning democracy is citizen participation and people empowerment. So my question is, first, to what extent are the local indigenous tribes of Mexico are participating in local governments, especially on a state-by-state level, or city-to-city level, or regional level? And number two, if they do participate in local governments, what are the positions that they are functioning with? Are these appointive or elective positions? Do they participate in city council or town council or whatever?
Well, it all depends on what state and what part of the state you're talking about. There's some states that have gone very heavily to this customs and uses, which is basically traditional forms of indigenous governance, and you would have a lot more indigenous representation in the actual positions, which would be equivalent to someone similar to a mayor. In other areas where you're keeping the traditional mestizo structure, which is what you find elsewhere in Mexico, there are a number of indigenous Mexicans who hold positions on city councils, on mayors, and even in the national congressional representation. So it's very widely diverse. But I would say the greatest participation is, as I would describe them more, I think accurately, as interest groups, functioning as groups which are trying to have their voice heard at the local level rather than being the decision makers themselves, even though you have examples of that. Remind me, what was the first question you had? Yeah.
Your study of biographies, how many, can you categorize it by indigenous as well?
I don't categorize it, this is an interesting, but in doing the biographies, and particularly where I find this most notable is in Congress. And there are I actually use some examples in the Metamorphosis of Democratic Leadership. And I might mention there are a number of interesting cases of women indigenous leaders moving beyond the local level and getting into national politics. And the thing that I would mention is that it's interesting that the majority of those indigenous representatives, and particularly the female version of that, have come through the PRI in recent years, not the other two parties, which I think is interesting.
We have a question. Yeah. There and then across the...
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet and Emerald Planet TV. And looking at Mexico now, it seems, and much of the report says, it's moved into a middle income status as a nation state. And so that brings additional expectations of, more jobs, better jobs, and also a cleaner environment. So what do you see as the balance between the business interest and environmental movement, not necessarily environmentalism, but a practical movement towards a better environment for the citizens? And then what would be the access among the various states, not just at the federal level, about how to identify those and what may be some of the opinion leaders at the state and local levels that possibly influence at the federal level?
Well, it's a very significant issue, as you suggest, in Mexico. I would say, interestingly, the most progress environmentally actually has been made along the border, which is one of the most, was an area which had some of the most excessive forms of pollution. And that's been through joint cooperation at the local level, which I think has been very important. The second point I would make is that Mexicans in general actually are very pro-environment. That is, they're part of the whole global trend that favors that. As you know, Calderon himself has stressed the whole idea of addressing the issues related to global warming. But in Mexico, it remains a very serious problem in most areas that has not been well addressed. So the difference between what people say they want and what is actually accomplished is significant. And I think that has a lot to do with the underdevelopment of other aspects of Mexico's economy. Even though it's one of the largest economies in the world, it's how that income is distributed and the per capita income of Mexico in relation to its rank. There's a huge disparity. It ranks in the 60s in terms of that per capita, and I think it's 13th or something in terms of its rank. So I think that it leaves a lot to be addressed. And I would say the other area which could exacerbate that issue as well as many other issues that I could identify is the continued persistence of monopolistic control over many sectors of the Mexican economy, which the parties, I can remember talking to a pre-senator just after Calderon was elected saying, we're finally going to address this issue. Well, it hasn't been addressed. So here we are 6 years later with no progress on that. And I think until that issue is addressed, it not only has implications for any of these other more sort of not specifically economic issues, but it has implications for Mexico's economic growth. I think it's a fundamental flaw in Mexico's development strategy.
The gentleman across the table. The gentleman first, and then Georgette, and then the lady after you. Yeah.
Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. One of the issues that has a lot to do with Mexico's competitiveness and economic growth is the labor movement. Can you talk about the trends in the labor movement and its political power, and especially with respect to the education or the teachers union and the Pemex union, and how and whether or not there's any chance for there to be real reform given their political strength?
Well, I would say no, especially in education and in oil, which are two, as you point out, and particularly, if you want to address every economic issue in Mexico, and particularly poverty, the fundamental issue to address first is improving both the quality of education and the number of people who actually complete not a college education, but an elementary and secondary education, and particularly a technical vocational secondary education. And it's so interesting you should ask me this. I was on public radio with a Dallas station on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, and it was an hour-long show where the person had obviously read this Mexico, Everything You Need to Know from cover to cover, and she had a lot of good questions. And anyway, I was commenting on that failure, and I got an email from a student I taught, believe it or not, in 1973, who has his own quite a successful business. And this business involved, one aspect of it was developing a program with the Mexican Secretariat of Public Education, both under Fox and under Calderon, to try to improve the quality of what was being taught and how it was being taught. And he said in this long email to me, both times they failed to do it. So here, he's been trying to do it for 12 years with them to help them accomplish this. And I'm not optimistic because I can't go into all the details about how labor unions function, and particularly because the educational union has played a very important role in political campaigns, and it will continue to do so. And when you can supposedly, claim to shift 1 million or more votes in one direction or the other, politicians are going to listen.
Georgia.
Yes, two questions. Thank you. How do the intellectuals perceive López Obrador? One. And then two, how do the Mexican public see the U.S. Mexico border? And I'm asking this because I've talked to a number of Mexicans who have said, well, you can't really open the border because all the Central Americans are going to come in just as well. So I don't know if that's a valid, I heard it from 4 different people.
Well, to take that issue first, I think what maybe, I can't imagine why they would think doing that doesn't mean that they would be coming in from the U.S., but if they would do that with the U.S., then people would claim, okay, well, why not have this between Guatemala and Mexico? And, I mean, that analogy has come up even now when Mexico complains about treatment of Mexican immigrants to the United States, and then it treats Guatemalan immigrants in a way that would not be acceptable to many people. It raises these comparisons, so I think that's why. As far as intellectual, basically, Georgette, it just all depends on what your political perspective is. So it depends on which intellectual you're asking, and I think that makes a huge difference because obviously López Obrador has a very particular political perspective, which a lot of intellectuals appreciate, but a lot of intellectuals don't think is what's going to solve Mexico's problems. So.
Kimberly Dvorak, The Examiner. My question is, what role do you think the narco-terrorists, the drug traffickers, are going to have in the upcoming election? And secondly, we always hear about, read about, write about the extreme, brutal, gruesome violence going on down there, yet we seem to actually fail to acknowledge that this country here, America, has such a strong addiction to drugs, and we're not doing much to address that. And what is your opinion on that?
My opinion is members of Congress don't have the courage to address it. That's the fundamental issue here. It has to be the number one issue. If you don't have the demand, you don't have the drug problem. 9% of all Americans over the age of 12 use some illegal, what is classified by Department of Health as an illegal drug. And most of those drugs that are imported, that aren't produced here in the United States, either come from Mexico or come through Mexico. So until we would actually reduce that, Mexico's not going to be able to do anything about dealing with the drug cartels. The money is just too great. Just to illustrate this is that in the entire Calderon administration, in a single year, the drug cartels would earn more billions of dollars than Calderon has spent on public security in 5.5 years. So if they can earn that kind of revenue, there's just absolutely no way that the government can deal with it. And besides, interdiction is not the problem. The problem is consumption and demand. So I agree with you. That violence is obviously been exacerbated by a proactive government strategy, which has been successful to the extent that it's captured certain drug cartel leaders, and it creates a temporary vacuum in one cartel versus another cartel, and that increases the competition. But that isn't the fundamental issue. Why don't members of Congress talk about this? Because it's so much easier to say the problem is next door in Mexico, and rather than to admit it's a social problem. Why are people consuming the drugs? That's a much more complex issue. And, what's interesting is that we, in terms of even our own funding, which goes all the way back to the Nixon administration, actually for most of that time, 85% or more of that money has been devoted to interdiction. Only 15% has been devoted to either educating people not to get on drugs or people who have become addicted to help them get off drugs, which is far more successful. It's not, that can't be the only solution, but it's a lot more successful than money spent on interdiction.
Get this out there in the public view. We're not seeing our universities stepping out front saying, look, we need to start driving the conversation that direction. It's obvious that we have a huge addiction problem. What are the universities going to be doing? And is there anything at your level that you can suggest to other co-workers that this needs to get out there to the forefront? We're not talking about this issue. You can't pick up the paper and that's the issue you're talking about. We're reading about the beheadings and the rest.
Well, I would say two things. One is that the education of, why not to get on drugs needs to start at the elementary school level. When I had children and was living in Iowa, they were doing actually a great job in this small community that I lived in. And I don't see that anymore. I don't hear anything about drug consumption in elementary and high school in terms of promoting an anti-educational effort to accomplish that. On the college level, I can just give you a beautiful example from the University of Arizona, where I often go to speak, and I was giving a talk on the drug cartels. And a student raises his hand. He said, well, I have to admit, I smoke marijuana. And he said, but what most and a lot of my friends on campus do. He said, but what we don't consider is what is happening when we're buying that marijuana. What has it generated if you follow back? He said nobody is connecting it to some violence that's being committed in Mexico. Well, that's the link that has to be advertised and demonstrated to college students, because they're just thinking, I'm not hurting anybody, I'm just consuming this drug. But it is, somewhere it is hurting somebody.
And a follow-up on that, in one of Rod's chapter in the handbook, it documents how about 500,000 jobs in Mexico are within the drug trafficking circuit. Barbara?
Yeah, I have a question. Despite the fact that I agree with everything that you've said about the drug consumption, I want to change the conversation to foreign relations and economics. And that is, how do you envision, both of you, what will happen to foreign and economic policy in Mexico with the next election? The reason I ask this is because when I've been following Brazil a little bit. I was in Brazil recently, and Brazil is doing quite well. And everyone says, well, Brazil is doing quite well because Brazil is allied to China, whereas, of course, Mexico is stuck with the United States. So do you see any shifting of both political relationship and economic relationship from what it is now to something else?
Honestly, I don't see any dramatic shift in the relationship, largely because of the reason why Mexico is much less successful than Brazil right up front is the fact that our recession has affected Mexico but not Brazil. If you look at the goods that Mexico buys from us and the goods that we sell to Mexico, and you calculate the number of jobs that Mexico provides to U.S., and also, I might add that, and Chris produced a very interesting book called Working Together. I recommend that you guys get a hold of that, with a lot of statistics, which we've been arguing for years, demonstrates that actually there's even Mexican investment in the U.S., California, Texas, for example, that's producing jobs. That tie is so fundamental. And I think people don't realize the percentage of exports that go from Mexican states. And Chris and I were talking about this. You know, nobody has any idea that proportionately the highest percentage of exports from New Hampshire are to Mexico. Well, New Hampshire. Oh, we.
What in particular, Chris?
What?
Chris, by the way, Chris also organized this forum today. I forgot to recognize him, as well as publishing that. Chris Wilson. And there's a copy out there.
On the stats.
Yeah, it's hard to get information.
Take a look at it.
Yeah.
But part of your conclusion, Chris, if I can abuse you with the microphone there, is also finding that, in fact, there's a great deal of joint production, right? I mean, it's not only that we export and import, but in fact, we're producing things together.
Sure, that's one of the key. I mean, that's what really means that the United States and Mexico economically will sort of sink and swim together. Is that not only are we trading to each other, which you could, perhaps switch that trade to another avenue very easily, but we're actually producing goods together, meaning a car built in Detroit is actually built in Detroit, Canada also, and Mexico, and the parts are shipped back and forth several times. The same is true for several other industries, and that just means that we need to improve competitiveness as a region rather than thinking about only improving competitiveness in Mexico or only improving competitiveness inside the United States.
Coming to your point about Brazil, you made me think on two things. One, that Brazil had two good presidents on a row, and that has an impact, as we also have learned from Bogota, that had two good mayors for a period of 10 years, and their impact was sensible. I got the feeling in Brazil you got the same. So countries react positively to good leaders and, of course, negatively to bad leaders. The second one, what Chris was just mentioning, I think that NAFTA, at least in Mexico, there is a movement that we have to start thinking not as a partnership of trade, but a partnership of production, in order for the continent to have a better position in the world competition, because it is not, we have to change focus on thinking in between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. No. It's the three of us looking at our advantages in the competition to Europe and Asia. That is what is going to be tough, and we better be prepared to that. And that's, at least, I don't know if you already had here at the Wilson Center with the Luises, Luis Rubio and Luis.
Last Friday.
Last Friday? Okay. They are bringing that message very clearly, that something is boiling up on that. Kevin.
Abuse, just to jump in on that, having worked long periods of time in both countries, one thing I think that people don't appreciate about Mexico until you leave it, and I can say this from my wife's standpoint who's Mexican, when we moved overseas, you realize Mexico has fiber optics in most of the country. You go to the most remote parts of the Yucatan and you've got high-tension power lines. There's a level of development in Mexico that you don't find in Brazil outside of Sao Paulo State. Sure. Sao Paulo State really is the Brazilian economy. So there's this idea that Brazil somehow is worlds ahead of Mexico, and it's far behind.
I would just add, too, on the, if we will, the social level, people don't realize that the homicide rate in Brazil is much higher than it is in Mexico.
Twice.
So it's a perception that you get in the media. What coverage do we have of Brazil compared to the coverage we have of Mexico and the United States? It's just not comparable, and therefore I think there are other misconceptions as well.
Dolia?
I wanted to ask you, this year there's elections here in the United States, two presidential elections every 12 years, they coincide. In the U.S., we've seen some presence of foreign policy, be it Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan, and also related to Mexico, but in a very negative way, particularly the immigration issue, who is very offensive so far, the way I've seen it. Perry is out, which is good, but he was calling for military and pushing the idea of the violence spreading into Texas and whatnot. In Mexico, so far, foreign policy and particularly U.S. Mexico relations have been pretty absent of the debate. I wanted to just get your thoughts on that, and whether it's better not to include it, since it's usually negative.
Right.
And I mean, I guess it's very natural that in any country that you have elections, the domestic issues are dominant. But since everything we have said here in terms of how interrelated these two countries are, is there any way to put some positive or at least not negative elements into the debate? I want to see the debates in Mexico if there's any foreign policy questions. Here they are, but they're usually not very productive.
Well, normally, even in Mexico's domestic presidential elections, just foreign policy just doesn't become an issue. Even its relationship with the United States, it's not an issue which changes voter opinions of the candidates. Probably the only, one of the only likely elements would be either the broad macroeconomic policy pursuit of the existing relationship with the United States, which I don't think most of the candidates would, want to get into in terms of saying how they would go about altering that relationship. The only other possible issue, other than maybe somebody mentioning wanting to have immigration reform, proposing that on the Mexican side, which is part of government policy from both the Fox and Calderon administration, is the security issue and the increased collaboration with the United States. That's a potential issue that might come up in a television debate. On the U.S. side, it's just not going to be the Mexico aspect of foreign policy is just not going to get to the presidential level, again, unless somebody, Gingrich, you'll notice that in one previous debate, actually made a very positive statement about granting whatever you want to call it, amnesty or legal status, to people who had been here a long time, who actually, in some cases, were eligible from when we actually had that many years ago. I thought it was the first actual thoughtful statement that any high public official or former public official had made in the U.S. in the last 10 years. But is it going to be, it's not going to become an issue because nobody wants to touch it. And, all you can... Yeah, but legalizing immigrants isn't, picking that up as a policy isn't going to get that vote. It has to be other things that they're going to address, because the negative side is far too great in terms of the potential votes that you're going to lose. It's just, I don't see it as the reason why it was important when Bush ran for the presidency is that at the time he ran, he actually was an advocate, and so were several other conservative major figures from Texas who were in the Congress. But that's not the case anymore. Everybody either doesn't want to say anything about it, or they're not going to say anything positive about it, even though people will say, yes, we need immigration reform, but they're not very specific about what they mean by immigration reform.
We have a question there, and then the last one with you.
Just more of a technical question. Has Mexico's move, structural organizational move towards transparency with IFI or whatever the organization is, actually given more transparency, and is it successful in helping researchers like you that are thinking about who's doing what in what organizations and where the monies flow and how the policies are made?
It's a great question. I'm probably one of the few scholars that actually I've used it since it went into effect in 2003. I used it in particular to get a lot of original information about the armed forces. And I can tell from the questions that are being asked, my colleagues in the media have some similar questions. The wonderful thing about it, and actually I think it's a much better program than the U.S. Freedom of Information Act in the sense that it's instant. You have 6 weeks to do it. And furthermore, it's all online. So I can go back and I can search any public institution for any question that's been asked and go through the questions and see what the answers. That means then I don't have to wait 6 weeks because I'm asking the same question. Found it very useful to do. But to demonstrate the other side of this, in writing the biographies book, the way I was going to get all the assistant secretaries was to write each individual agency and say, I want all the names of assistant secretaries and their position in the years they were in office from 1993 to the present, which was the last edition. You can't believe the difficulty that some of these agencies had. This is like 15 names chronologically. Oh my gosh. And 4 of these agencies, I can just remember off the top of my head, Social Security, they asked, you can get a 2-week extension. They all needed a 2-week extension to ask this question. And in Gobernación, when I did Gobernación, Miguel got a kick out of this. The current Secretary of Gobernación is a friend of mine, and at that time he was Assistant Secretary of Gobernación. And I said, one of these doesn't quite make sense. And so I sent him the list that I had that I was going to publish. And he writes back and he says, just give me a few minutes, and tomorrow I'll send you a list with a revision. There are a couple of these that are incorrect on the dates. So you can get the information, but it may not necessarily be correct. And I think the most important information, again, using SEDENA and the Navy, is getting information about who they awarded contracts to, more budgeting information. And also, it's so interesting, one of the first questions that everybody wanted to know, what about salaries? So because they got asked this so many times, it's on the website, That's the one they don't want to have to deal with, even though they can just click and send you the answer that was already provided by somebody else.
Since Georgia and Barbara here, I should say it gets only worse when you go to municipalities.
Yeah.
And doing research many years ago in a particular middle-sized municipality, and I couldn't get any of went to the municipal government to try and get the past informes municipales, the official document that comes out every year, and they didn't have it. They only had anything of the current government. Sure. I was able to find a couple thanks to politicians who had served in former governments, but I finally just one day went online to the Library of Congress, and sure enough, this medium-sized city, all of the informes municipales were actually in the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
So,
That's exactly right.
So the depository of information is before you go to IFI, you can even go to the Library of Congress.
Well, another illustration of that too is just I was going to mention it with the biographies book. That biographies book that I just published is the only source in Spanish, English, French, whatever language you want, that actually lists every position and every person that held it in the years they were in office. The only government agency which has actually done anything about that over time actually has been Congress, which has created a computer file, which is fabulous, this gigantic PDF file of every member of Congress from 1917 to the present. And I found it a critical, valuable, historical source because I discovered that many of the current PON leaders were the children not of people that held a congressional position because they didn't win, but in that same other file, it's all the memorias of Congress, and it has every election, who are the candidates and the votes. And I discovered all these fathers that had tried to win an election and didn't, so they actually had politically active parents that were involved in these elections. But I wouldn't have been able to determine that without that source. The Supreme Court has also done that. But the federal government, since the late 1980s and 1993 was the last directory they ever published that is really useful in that respect.
We have a question back there, and then the last one over there.
I was struck by this prediction that we're going to have another close election with Andrés Manuel as one of the leading candidates. And a couple of things sort of struck me about this. One is, what evidence is there that he has actually grown and matured and that he will be able to convey this to anyone who witnessed what happened in 2006? I mean, he has the highest negatives of any candidates, and I think it's going to be difficult for him to overcome that perception based upon what happened, even if he has grown and matured. And the second question has to do with the new laws and regulations regarding negative campaigning. Because, as you know, of course, one of the reasons why that gap narrowed so dramatically was this very effective media campaign by the PAN, which is now technically illegal. So, how do you think negative campaigning are these actually going to be effective regulations? And if not, or if so, what is going to bring about such a dramatic turnaround if the candidates themselves are somewhat limited in the negative things they can say about their rivals?
I probably shouldn't be answering it because that's Miguel's prediction. I'm not necessarily in agreement that that's what will actually happen, but I agree with him that there is a possibility that Peña Nieto will lose a lot of the support that he has right now. If people were to go out, vote right now, he'd get somewhere actually between 45% and 50% if you look at all the alliances that the parties have. It's sort of like López Obrador's position in 2006 at the beginning, in the sense that it's Peña Nieto's campaign to lose rather than the other way around. Because of what I said, the high negatives that that López Obrador has, it's very hard to reverse a negative. It's easy to get negatives, but it's not easy to remove them. And I think you should keep that in mind. So it's sort of what kind of mistakes does Peña Nieto make that would result? And I think the other thing, I think Miguel's right, maybe he didn't say this, but implying it, that well, in a three-way race, you'd expect, okay, PAN is another alternative, particularly because if Vasca Mota does get the nomination, as I mentioned, she has very low negatives, which is more comparable to Peña Nieto. If she can earn higher positives, she has the potential to do well, but what is suffocating her ability to do that is that she's a panista, and people are fed up with these two administrations. So she has to overcome that difficulty, not a negative, reaction to her personally, but the fact that she would be a continuation of the two previous administrations' likely failures to meet voter expectations.
I would agree with Rod, and that points to the dynamics of the electorate as the campaigns come to a closing. And what you had, the high percentages that Peña Nieto got, is the outcome of his media, particularly TV presence, and his charismatic appeal, the very good looking on TV and all of that. But that's kind of the top. And then the only way for him is to go down. He cannot go up to those numbers. Now, what happens once he's started going down? Where would those votes go for? Josefina is a very good candidate if she wins, but that is a question mark. And the second is that she has a burden, which is the PAN image after these two terms in office. So the only other way out is that's going to raise López Obrador. Nothing very much that he's doing on his own. What he did it in the past. The other option is to think that López Obrador could happen something like what happened to Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, that after such a terrific performance in '88, the second two terms that he tried, he never went up 18%. But that could potentially be the case, but the problem is that if PAN was in a very good position, then I would consider that, but I can't. The last question.
Dr. Sam Hancock again of Emerald Planet and Emerald Planet TV. In looking at the media that we see in the United States, it's mostly negative, although there are a lot of really good things going on. And I think Chris talked about this cross-border trade and manufacturing and the interconnectedness of the economy, which also relates to the environment. And looking at the media in Mexico, since we are a producer of TV content, what would be some of the suggestions you may have about how to make the contacts there to find out what are the good things that are going on, both for environment and the economy, that we in turn then can broadcast out to the world that could be helpful for Americans to learn about Mexico, but the Mexicans in many ways to learn about themselves?
Well, just off the top of my head, I think two things. One, I think it would be interesting to contact people who live in border cities on both sides, government officials. And consuls are a good way to do this too, Mexican consulates. And you'd be amazed at the collaboration, whereas we get no sort of public vision of the collaboration at the national level. At the local level, there's a lot of collaboration going on. And it's led to positive results along the border. And I think that's very important. I've been to several conferences where we've had mayors and consuls there, and they highlight this, and they would like people to know that they have worked differently sometimes from their national counterparts. And perhaps another way to do it in large metropolitan areas is to go, and you probably do this with environmentally oriented NGOs, but just go to other NGOs that have other goals and see what they can tell you about the positive policy consequences of some of their efforts.
An additional comment that I would say is, as you know, the largest community of Americans, retired Americans, is in Mexico. There you would have a source of ideas. And the other two things that I could think of is the interaction between energy and labor. Mexico could be a source of energy that is extremely important and could even go higher. And labor would be for Mexico a very critical exchange token. In the U.S., there is a lot of concern about that. But if you think in Puerto Rico, well, of course, the size is much different. But after 100 years, Puerto Rico being associated with the U.S., half of the population that doesn't want to come to the continent, they remain in Puerto Rico. So we have to think twice about those kind of things. Well, I think it's been a wonderful presentation and session and comments and questions. And thank you very much, Rod. Thank you very much to the Wilson Center. Thank you
all for attending. I appreciate it.